Welcome to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. Today we have a very special guest. He's a senior national writer for The Athletic. He was the award winner of Sports Writer of the Year in 2015 by Sport Media Canada and is the author of the book Before the Lights Go Out, A Season Inside, a Game on the Brink. Please welcome Sean Fitz-Gerald. Sean, thanks for joining me on today's episode. Really excited to talk with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you have had the great pleasure of dawning wisdom upon my sports journalism class. And one of the things that you in particular know quite a lot about, or have also written quite a lot about, is minor hockey and the issues that surround the game, particularly in the aforementioned book during the introduction, and also based on some of the other articles that you've written for The Athletic. I know that you have two young ones at home, and you're also a parent of minor hockey, and you're someone who grew up around the sport. What intrigued you to dive deeper into the subject with your career during your time at The Athletic? And even before that, what piqued your interest about looking into the issues of minor hockey?
Yeah, I mean, it predated my time at The Athletic by just a little bit. I'd started having conversations with an editor at McClellan Stewart with Penguin Random House just before I joined The Athletic. Yeah, no, like you mentioned, I have an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old now. They're a little bit younger and just taking their first strides into minor hockey. And yeah, I mean, for years and years and years, I've read stories about, or I'd written a few stories about the studies that you'd see or hear, from I think Royal Bank of Canada did one, and more anecdotal evidence about how hockey was becoming too expensive, the $200, $300 sticks, the expensive skates, and that's why people were leaving the game. So, having read those for so long, I wanted to know how they started to sort of manifest themselves at the grassroots level. Who was playing hockey, what were the demands, financial, time, and otherwise, on families who were in hockey, and just sort of explore and see and try and paint a broad sort of picture of how the game looked in Canada, at that point in the 21st century. And yeah, what you find is it's a pretty closed circle. It's you have to be able to afford obviously the registration costs, the equipment, but also if your child's on a competitive program, you have other costs that aren't necessarily on the brochure when you sign up. It's specialized training, specialized coaching, and then there are soft costs. Are you in a position as a parent to take Fridays off of work because that's when tournaments start? Are you able as a parent to get your child who might be too young to carpool to a practice at 5 p.m. on a Wednesday on the other side of town? So all these things add up. And what it does is it adds layers and layers, or increases barriers, whichever metaphor you prefer, and limits the number of people who can easily access the game. So what that does is sort of fundamentally alters the tether, the connection that hockey had with this country for so long, that, for years and years, the stories of Gordie Howe, learning to skate on a pair of rusted donated skates from a neighbor during the Depression. Today, if Gordie Howe didn't have a power skating instructor and a skills session every other week, would he have become the Gordie Howe that he did? It's gone from being the game for everybody to the game for a select few, and that was sort of the idea, to sort of explore that book.
I know that one thing you mentioned to our class was the idea that hockey down the road may become a secondary version of polo, so to speak. Not to say that necessarily it will cease to exist as a sport, but what do you think would be a catalyst in that being able to change potentially? Because there are many issues within minor hockey, and people will try to explore, well, what can we do to make the sport more affordable? Or will basketball ever catch it? People talk about soccer now with the success of the Canadian men's national team combined with the women's national team. But in terms of when you explored potential solutions, what sort of things started to come to your mind when you think about what can be done to maybe reverse the ill effects of hockey becoming very exclusive, especially for a certain social class of people?
Yeah, I mean, money's part of it, but it's not the only thing. And I think it's a mistake now to say that money is the driving force. I mean, there's lots of money in communities, as example in Brampton. which has a very strong South Asian population, money isn't an issue. I mean, those houses are really expensive too. The issue is, I mean, money is one part of it, but the other one is making it more welcoming, making more of an effort to commit to connect with communities who might not otherwise be represented underneath the roof of the arena. It's, you know, little things. It could be, you know, starting an equipment bank where, you know, Matthias, you play hockey, and when you grow out of your shin pads, you donate them back to the local hockey association in exchange for a small discount on your registration for next year. So now those shin pads can go to a kid who might just be coming in. So, you know, parents who, you know, maybe they don't know how to put on hockey equipment. Do you put the socks on first and then the shin pads? Do you put the pants on first? When do the skates go on? What other equipment do you need? You can show up on a day in September and you'll have volunteers who are there to say, here's the equipment you need. Here's how you put it on safely. Here's, you know, what you're going to need for the rest of the season. And then, you know, bringing it back at the end of the year, or it's yours to keep, whichever the program you want to implement. But what that does is it lowers the barrier. So parents who aren't sure if their kids are going to like hockey don't have to fork out all of the money for the equipment. But more than that, they can go in and learn the game alongside their kids, how the equipment goes on. Something so small as that, that if you play hockey, you might not even consider, can be a bit of a barrier because you don't know what kind of gear your kid wants and you don't want to show up, I don't know, wearing a bicycle helmet and everybody else is going on the ice with a full face mask. I mean, those are real things. And there are so many issues and hurdles like that that might be invisible to people who are in hockey, that's why it's important to reach out to folks who aren't in hockey so that they can sort of say, hey, here's some things you want to consider. And therefore you can, you know, do a better job of getting out there and making meaningful connections and developing programs that are positioned for success to get folks into the arena, because that's what you need.
During your involvement with minor hockey, particularly as a parent, have you ever had experiences or interactions with parents who were newcomers to the sport or had kids that were playing for the first time? And maybe if you weren't directly involved, maybe you had seen it from afar. Have you ever had experiences like that in recent memory?
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, you know, just this past winter, my eldest plays on a team and I'm an assistant coach on it, and they're out playing in an outdoor rink. They rented ice every week to play in an outdoor rink in Scarborough. And one day at the end of a skate, a family came up and the mom said that, you know, they lived not far from there and that, you know, I think they had a 7 year old who was on the outdoor ice all the time, skating, playing, was playing shinny after us. And she was trying to navigate, you know, where do I sign up? Do I put him in AAA? Do I put him in AA? Do I put him in single A? What's house league? And hockey doesn't do a very good job of explaining what all of that is, of guiding folks to the entry point, of saying, okay, you know, why is, just as an example, you know, why isn't there one website where I can go, say, for the Greater Toronto Hockey League, pop in my postal code, the age of my child and their relative experience, and have, you know, geographically and otherwise a guidebook for where I may want to look. Do I want to look at, say, in the East End, Victoria Village or Don Mills? What level of hockey is my child going to play? All of these things that make the user experience a little bit easier and less difficult to navigate. Again, it's one of those things like the equipment bank that, you know, if you're in the game, you don't give it a second thought, but if you're new to a game, it's absolutely inscrutable. So, you know, when we talk about lowering barriers, they're not all these broad existential questions. Some of them are just pretty simple and straightforward and wouldn't cost a lot of money. But what it does require is you to make connections with people who aren't already in the game.
And I'm sure if you reflect back to your younger days of playing sports, that you could think about what that experience would have been like if you hadn't had the opportunity to have someone show you where to go, what to do, to be introduced properly. And I know when I grew up playing sports as a kid, like I didn't really feel like hockey was my thing because it wasn't necessarily ingrained in my family's culture or background. But at the same time, you know, there are people now from diverse backgrounds who are continuing to play hockey, and it has been a thing for a longer time than maybe some are led to believe. But it is a difficult topic, I think, to it's not one size fits all or one big swing fixes all. And these little things that you're talking about are definitely great ways to really decrease the barriers to the game, especially within the context of Southern Ontario, where the population is extremely diverse as anywhere in Canada.
Yeah, no, and it's not just Ontario. I mean, the Lower Mainland and British Columbia. There's a bunch of places, and there's some really good programs being launched. Hockey Nova Scotia has a hockey lab where they're trying, to throw funding at a broad range of ideas, with the hope that what might work in Nova Scotia can be scalable and work, not only across that province but across all of Canada.
So I want to ask about some of the particular articles of interest that you've written about with the Athletic recently. You've been interviewing a lot of media members within the landscape of Canadian sports media and getting to know a bit about some of the journeys of people like Nabil Kareem, Rochelle Pounder, and others like that. What has piqued your interest in switching to, or maybe not necessarily entirely switching, but writing more articles surrounding the topic of members of Canadian sports media?
Yeah, I'm always interested in how the sausage is made. I've spent my career here, something a little bit north of 20 years. And yeah, I'm interested to see, who's making the journey, what their path might entail, and how the system sort of works. I mean, right now, obviously it's a shifting landscape across all sectors in media, but television and radio are undergoing some pretty acute challenges, especially in Canadian radio, sports radio. There have been significant job losses, cutbacks of, not just folks behind the scenes, but also some pretty big names who would normally be on the microphone, and that's all within the last 5 years. So, as somebody who's been a consumer for a very long time and somebody who's been in the industry for a long time, I am interested to see how this industry shifts, what it might portend for the future, and basically where Canadians are going to get their information moving forward.
Now, some of the challenges that you mentioned exist, no question, within the realm of social media changing the way that consumers are absorbing the information. Like you said, television, radio have become things of the past in some ways, more radio maybe than television, because people are still watching video, like that old song goes, video killed the radio star. But I think that it is interesting to see how they are adjusting to the challenges and what have been some of the best examples of ways in which media members have adjusted to the changing landscape, maybe in terms of maybe referring to people specifically who have had more experience and have been in the industry longer, rather than those who are just starting out and are born into the adjustments that older members are needing to make.
Yeah, you can take a look across Canada, really, because there have been significant changes. We can look at radio. So in Vancouver, Blake Price and Matt Sakaris were part of, basically an entire station shuttering. So Bell Media, I guess, last year, decided to switch its signals in Vancouver. It was Winnipeg and Hamilton, from TSN to. Two of them went to 24-hour comedy stations, and one went to or was it One Business, Two Comedy? Yeah. So all of the folks who are working in sports, unfortunately, lost their jobs. So what we see in Winnipeg and Vancouver are, groups of those people. So in Vancouver, it's Blake Price and Matt Sakaris have launched their own podcast. But more than that, they've built in a lot of the same things that make it sound like what they did on sports radio. So, they have the local sponsors who were sponsoring with them on the radio. They have a new studio. And what they do is, for 3 hours every day, they're on YouTube, they're live streaming. And then what they do is they produce that all for a podcast that people can download and listen to whenever. So what they're talking about, the content is very similar to what you would have found on the radio, but they've shifted platforms. And their hope is that their audience follows. Because again, if you've been listening to somebody, radio is a very intimate medium. They're right with you, either in your ear as you're walking along or in your car speakers as you're driving. So they're hoping that the folks follow them. And, they've been at this for more than a year and they're still going. So I think that's probably hopeful that, this could be a way into the future. In Winnipeg, it was even more, challenged because, the radio station there, the TSN station, was the only 24-hour sports talk station in Winnipeg. So two folks there decided to, launch Winnipeg Sports Talk, which is, again, essentially sports talk radio. And, a lot of the advertisers have followed, some of their audience has followed. And again, they're hopeful that, as sort of that corporate media retreats, that they can sort of run in and fill the void. And, there's a different approach here in Toronto with the Steve Dangle Podcast Network, SDPN, where they're, not only leveraging Steve Glynn's success on YouTube as a long-suffering Maple Leafs fan, but also with a podcast and now rolling out several other new shows. So as the radio stations owned by Rogers Sports and Media and Bell Media sort of retreat and cut and contract, what you're seeing is a bunch of independent groups trying to find their way in to fill that void and connect with that audience that grew up or really, really liked that content, and finding a way to get them that content and make a business of it themselves.
With the examples of the groups in Vancouver and in Winnipeg, I know specifically here in Winnipeg that Hustler and Remus, who started Winnipeg Sports Talk, when chatting with Hustler about what that process was like, it just seems so scary at first, because someone like him who's had experience doing a similar thing for a decade and change, to having to figure out this, maybe not entirely new, but having to change your medium at the drop of a hat without any warning, it can be a scary kind of thing. And I mean, with what you do, writing, well, I don't know if writing will ever cease to exist, but obviously the medium of writing has maybe changed, not as much as radio, but I couldn't even imagine what that would be like if I woke up the next day and my job didn't exist or was defunct, and you had to figure out a way to put bread back on the table, and also to find something to do every single day that gives you a lot of purpose and that you enjoy. And that changing of the guard has really, I think, forced the content to become that much better, because you look at what the guys have done in Vancouver and Winnipeg, people are still following as if TSN 1040 and 1290 still existed.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's democratized the whole process. That the gatekeepers used to be the station managers at the radio station. They got to decide who the listeners had access to. Now, I mean, look at the conversation we're having here, right? You are the media now, right? You are broadcasting, you are asking questions, you are, not to make this sound transactional, but you're trying to develop content that you think people want to consume right here, right now. That's what we're doing, right? Like hot wave. That's the content people want to consume. Whereas before, that's behind a gate. Those gates are falling or opening, again, whichever metaphor you choose. And what's coming in place is, yeah, folks are saying, look, if you like the content we provided on this other platform, please join us here. But what that also does is, again, for folks like you, folks like anybody else who's running an independent podcast, it's the same opportunity. It's the opportunity to say, I have an interesting perspective. I have something that I think people will have interest in, so I can broadcast and essentially become old-time sports radio, except on a new platform. It's really, in a lot of ways, a really exciting time. It's really nerve-wracking for legacy media, for traditional media, for even new media. You're seeing lots of companies come up, some struggling, some really, really thriving, and then, enduring struggles along the way. It's a completely shifted landscape from when I was a kid, from, the 1950s, when it was TV, newspaper, and not that I grew up in the 50s, but, TV, newspaper, and radio, that's where you got it. Now it can be anywhere, in any form, at any time.
Newspaper too, you bring up that medium. That one that has had to probably roll the punches even harder than some of the others, because at least radio can turn to podcasts, and and TV can turn it to YouTube or TikTok. But with newspaper, like that is writing, but that goes to the internet. And then,
Well, I mean, more people are consuming newspaper content than ever before in human history, right? Like it's not that it's been devalued, that the paywalls didn't come up until after that. Initially, newspapers just sort of gave their stuff away for free, right? That there was the print paper where I had a physical newspaper in my hand, and that's where, I don't know, the Brick or Leon's or wherever would pay $50,000 for a color ad on a full page, to then just giving away the content for free on the internet. So no, I think what newspapers have done is they've adapted, some better than others, obviously. But I mean, take a look at the New York Times, which now owns the Athletic, where I work. But they have, I think it's somewhere close to 10 million online subscribers. That's massive. You take a look at the Star, you take a look at the Globe, you take a look at Post Media. Canadians are still consuming a ton of that. The question is how do you adapt that business model? So it's not that the content is any less sought after. It's how do you make the business model where you could get a furniture maker to pay $50,000 for one page of an ad to, what does that ad look like online? How do you drive value? How do you prove value? And then you add the fact that the internet's a global marketplace of ideas and consumerism. So how do you find a spot for a local newspaper in Burlington, Ontario, where it can make a lot of money or enough money to survive on the internet? So, in that respect, newspapers were, to bring in, a Christmas story, a Christmas carol, they were the ghost of Christmas future for every other platform. And a lot of what newspapers have already gone through, you're starting to see happen in radio and TV.
and you're 100% correct. You bring up the example of the Athletic being purchased by New York Times. The New York Times have maybe not perfected, but they have a business model that has been proven to be successful so far. And again, the looking at how smaller newspapers, like you mentioned, Burlington, Ontario, or other smaller communities and Canadian provinces trying to find ways to have a successful business model is maybe part of what's going on currently, but it has predicted at least the future of what was what was to come with the other two mediums. And even though newspaper is the oldest of the three, it's the one that has it is still being consumed to this day. And it has altered, like magazines. Maybe people don't buy physical magazines anymore, but subscribing to magazines on your phone or iPad is easier than ever. And I think that it brings a level of convenience that will continue to reel in people, like subscription-based music services. When people used to have to pay 99 cents for a song on iTunes, now you just pay $4.99 or $9.99 if you're a student or not, and you can listen to however much music you want on Apple Music or on Spotify. And then that, maybe it's not making as much money per song as people would have had to pay back in the day, but now they're veering people away from piracy more than before because of the fact that it's more convenient to just pay to subscribe and then go at it.
Yeah, no, and there's a bunch of different models. I mean, the Winnipeg Free Press, not that long ago, had a pay by the article subscription model that, okay, maybe you don't want to pay the whole $10 a month, but you want to read one specific writer, one specific beat. Every time you click on a story, it can be, I don't know, 50 cents, a buck. I can't remember what the number was, but that's one way. Yeah, the flat monthly fee. The challenge is that, for legacy media that's making the transition, there's some sunk costs. There's a way of doing things that as you're transitioning, you're going to hit these bumpy times. And that's what we've been sort of enduring in the media for the last, I'd say, 20 years, of making that transition, of finding that business model that'll work, of connecting with that audience on a new platform in a new space. And I think that's sort of what we're talking about. Like, radio and newspaper and TV aren't dead. They're critically important, as again, for a bunch of different reasons we're learning the importance. They're just basically trying to connect with that audience on a new platform or series of platforms.
And I remember people saying to me, maybe 5 to almost 10 years ago, people are going to stop watching TV altogether and no one's ever going to watch it anymore. But when you look at a medium like television, maybe there's a lot more streaming services people are using, but at the end of the day, people are still consuming video content. So I think even in some small way, that TV will still exist, maybe not as much as before, but like you said, all these mediums are still important for people to consume content through, but maybe the way that people are consuming them is changed slightly. But I don't know if we'll ever see radio cease to exist or TV cease to exist, at least in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is a bit of a difference. You're talking about scripted television. I might be talking more about sort of the news product and the news programming, right? Yeah, I mean, Netflix, pick a streaming service. I don't want to list them all here because we'll be here for an hour. But yeah, no, it's critically important that they find a new place to exist and that they find a way to thrive, and that whatever new digital business model they find helps them succeed in the long term, because newspapers, radio, and television and the news gathering services they provide, most limited to Canadians, critically important for the health of the country.
I wanted to ask about the beginning of your journey into being a sports writer, because I know that you're a grad of Ryerson, now changing to Toronto Metropolitan University, and that you've had a plethora of experiences across many different news outlets, websites. What, to boiling it down to the bare bones, what was it that made you want to get into being a writer and to covering sports?
I'm too stupid to do anything else. I have no marketable skill, and nobody wants to hear what I have to say. I was no good at science. I was no good at math. Yeah, no, it's honestly, it was something that for whatever reason, I just grew up always reading the newspaper. I mean, I grew up in a family of journalism. It was just what I was going to do from the time I was in grade 6 until it was time to pick which university I was going to go to. There was nothing else. I didn't apply. I didn't apply to do any other program at anywhere else. Really, it was I think 2 journalism schools I applied to, and if I didn't get into those, Lord knows what I'd be doing now. Might still be sitting in that high school cafeteria staring out the window.
What was the most memorable memory that you have from the time that you spent as a journalism student?
Oh my God. That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, the thing about journalism school was, I mean, just the idea of being there with a lot of high energy folks who really wanted to learn as much as you did, right? And maybe even, I mean, certainly more so, just really motivated, smart people that you're able to sort of listen to and learn from. I ended up marrying one of them. My wife is now the education reporter at the Globe and Mail. Yeah, it was just the energy of the time, and just being around smart people and watching how they found their way.
Sean, we are getting towards the end of our time in today's episode, so I didn't want to ask you a few rapid fire, as quickly as we can make them, questions to have a little bit more fun before we part for today.
Sure.
What was the craziest event that you had to cover, maybe in terms of the way that it went down, maybe in terms of what happened, and what do you remember from it?
This is a rapid fire. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I think, one of the most memorable was 2012, the London Olympics. Women's boxing was making its debut as a medal sport. And I was there to cover a Canadian fighter from Windsor, Ontario, who, for a variety of reasons, wasn't able to find a lot of success in her first bout. And while I was there, it was in this big sort of convention hall in East End of London. And as we were wrapping up with the Canadian fighter, this eruption, this cheer, this sound, this wall of sound came out from the hall, and I poked my head around, and it was this Irish fighter. So I made a note to sort of follow how she was going to do. And sure enough, a few days later, I read that she'd qualified to fight in the gold medal match. So started working on a feature and found out that her name was Katie Taylor. She'd originally played soccer on the national team in Ireland, and she was a boxer. She was trained by her father. She's from a small town just outside of Dublin, I should say, called Bray. And it sounds like an Irish version of Rocky, but where she was training, it was, this very spare gym, didn't even have its own bathroom. So when you had to use facilities, and this isn't an Irish joke, but you had to go down to the pub down the street because there wasn't anything in the gym. So, in 2012, she advances to fight for this gold medal. And Ireland historically hadn't won a lot of gold medals at the Summer Games. And more than that, it was still emerging from the wreckage of the economic collapse in 2008, where, Ireland was hit very hard by, the world financial crisis. So you had folks who didn't have work or didn't have a lot of work, didn't have a lot of money, paying to get across from Ireland to the UK to watch Katie Taylor fight for gold in this convention hall in East London. And I remember, and hopefully we'll always remember, when she walked in, she was fighting a fighter from Russia. The aluminum stands, the temporary aluminum stands, I think there were 10,000 people. 9,500 of them were from Ireland. And when they all started jumping up and down, it sounded like what you'd imagine, like a tropical thunderstorm, just this low rolling bass, combined with the cheering and the clapping, was like a sound that I've never heard, before or since. And I've, again, as you mentioned off the top, been very fortunate to cover the Super Bowl, to cover Grey Cup, to cover NHL playoffs, NBA, whatever. What I saw that day, she eventually won, is unlike anything I've ever seen. It was just this pure joy, this exaltation of this woman who, had at least 10,000 people on her shoulders that day in the building, but also had, an entire country watching her on the national broadcaster back in Ireland. And the fact that she emerged victorious was, one of the greatest things I've ever seen in my life.
There needs to be a movie made about that somewhere down the line. And maybe you can be the screenwriter for it in your next venture.
Potentially. I won't be on screen because nobody wants to see that, but maybe I'll try and write it.
Favorite hockey movie of all time?
Oh, geez. That's a really good question. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess you could go. I mean, Slapshot's a pretty old favorite one. I mean, there's some really cheesy elements to Youngblood, an old Rob Lowe, Patrick Swayze movie. It was filmed at Ted Reeve, a rink around the corner from me here. But yeah, no, I don't know. I'd have to really give that some thought. That wouldn't fit in your rapid fire model here.
Best NBA player of all time, Jordan or LeBron?
I mean, LeBron is doing things that's just incredible. I mean, my generational bias would say Jordan. I'd also probably want to take a look back and really analyze the statistics with Wilt Chamberlain.